6 weeks. That's how long Nancy Guthrie has been missing. No arrests, no answers, just silence. But now, investigators have shifted focus to one object: a car, and what they found inside it may have just changed everything. 6 weeks of silence, of unanswered calls, of a house that still stands exactly where she left it, but without her inside. And if you think that means investigators have nothing, you would be wrong. Because somewhere inside this case, something has shifted. Not loudly, not publicly, but enough that the tone of this investigation has changed. Authorities are still not naming a suspect. They are still not revealing their full theory. But behind closed doors, something is being re-examined. And it all comes down to one object. Not the front door, not the porch, not even the masked man caught on camera. A car, the son-in-law's car. And what investigators say was found inside that vehicle did not just add to the case. It may have changed it. Pause for a second, because this is where everything turns. Up until now, this case has been about what happened at the house. The blood on the porch, the masked figure, the unanswered timeline. But now, the question is no longer just what happened there. It's what happened after. And that shift is everything. So let me ask you something before we go any further. Drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? Because cases like this, they don't move forward from one place. They move forward when thousands of people start paying attention to the same detail at the same time. And right now, all eyes are on that core. Because here is the question investigators are now quietly asking. What exactly was inside it? Think about that. Not what was seen, not what was reported, but what was left behind. Was it something microscopic? A fiber that didn't belong? A trace of soil from a place the vehicle was never supposed to be? Was it biological? DNA that connects two locations that should never have touched? Or something even more unsettling? Something that ties directly into the timeline of the night Nancy vanished? Because here's the truth about vehicles in cases like this. They don't just transport people. They carry moments. They carry contact. They carry movement. A car doesn't forget. It holds what people leave behind, whether they meant to or not. And once investigators start treating a vehicle not as transportation, but as evidence, everything changes. Now, before we go deeper into what may have been found, you need to understand the weight of this moment. Because this case did not start with a car. It started with a disappearance that didn't make sense. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, a woman known in her community, a routine, a life, a presence, and then gone. No warning, no clear explanation, just a house that should have held her and didn't. What investigators found at that house only deepened the mystery. Blood, not a small amount, enough to confirm that something had gone wrong. Something violent, something that didn't belong in the quiet rhythm of that home. And then there was the footage. A masked figure, captured, but not identified. A presence that turned speculation into something real and something dangerous. Because once you know someone was there, you stop asking if something happened, and you start asking who. But even with that, the case stalled. No suspect named, no public arrests, only fragments, mixed DNA, unconfirmed vehicle sightings, and a growing sense that whatever happened that night was not random. Authorities began to say it quietly. They believed Nancy was targeted. And when a case becomes targeted, It narrows, because that means intent. And intent always comes from somewhere. But here, where things get complicated. Because for weeks, all of that evidence stayed where it started. At the house, at the porch, at the camera, until now. Because when investigators shift their attention away from the scene and toward an object connected to someone inside the circle, that's not routine. That's a decision. And decisions like that don't happen without reason. So let's slow this down. Let's walk into this moment the way investigators do. Carefully, because the way a car is processed in a case like this is not what most people imagine. There is no rushing, no assumptions. Every step is controlled, documented, preserved, because once you touch something, you change it. And in a case where the smallest trace could mean everything, you don't get a second chance. So it starts with stillness. The car is photographed exactly as it is. Doors closed, windows as found, interior untouched, every angle captured. Because before you look for what's inside, you have to prove what it looked like before you found it. Then comes the slow entry. Door opened, carefully, not just to see, but to preserve. Because even the air inside a vehicle can carry evidence. And this is where tension changes. It becomes quiet, technical, focused, seats examined, not just the surface, but the seams. Because things fall into seams. Fibers, hair, fragments of contact, floor mats lifted. Because what settles beneath them often tells a different story than what sits on top. The trunk opened, because if something was transported, this is where silence becomes evidence. And then the hidden spaces, compartments, gaps, places most people forget exist. But investigators don't forget, because those are the places people rely on when they think something won't be found. And then comes the most important part. Collection, not of objects, but of traces. Things you cannot see unless you know how to look. Fibers, soil, biological residue. Each one lifted, cataloged, sent away. Because what matters is not what it looks like in that moment, but what it becomes under analysis. And this is where the case changes. Because discovery is only the beginning. Meaning is everything. Now we leave the car, and we enter the lab, where questions don't get louder. They get sharper. DNA is compared, matched, or ruled out. Environmental traces are analyzed. Where did this soil come from? Does it match the area around Nancy's home? Or somewhere else entirely? Fibers are tested. Do they belong to the vehicle? Or to something that was inside it temporarily? And slowly, the answers begin to form patterns, connections, links that either hold or break. And this is where I want you to pay very close attention. Because the most dangerous moment in any investigation is not when something is found. It's when that something begins to connect. Because once evidence starts linking 2 points together, the timeline starts to move. And when the timeline moves, everything else has to move with it. Movements are questioned. Routes are re-examined. Access is re-evaluated. And suddenly, what was once a fixed sequence of events is no longer stable. It starts shifting, rebuilding, rewriting itself, based on what that car may be telling investigators. And here's the part that should make you pause. Because evidence like this does not just add detail. It forces choices. It forces investigators to decide. Does this point inward? Or does it eliminate something we thought was true? And that is where this case becomes something else entirely. Because now, it splits. Two paths, both dangerous, both capable of changing everything. And we're about to step into that split. Because what comes next is where the pressure begins to build on everyone connected to this case. Because once a case splits, it stops being about what might have happened and starts becoming about what cannot be true anymore. And that is a much more dangerous place for any investigation to be. Because now, every piece of evidence is no longer just information. It's a filter, and whatever doesn't survive that filter gets removed. So let's walk into that split, slowly, because this is where the pressure begins to take shape. Path 1, the one investigators never say out loud too early, is the possibility that what was found inside that car points inward, not outward, not to a stranger, not to someone passing through, but to someone already inside the circle of this case. And if that is true, then everything that once felt distant suddenly becomes close, familiar, uncomfortable. Because when evidence starts leaning inward, relationships are no longer just relationships. They become variables. Movements are no longer routine. They become timelines. And proximity becomes something that must be explained. Now listen carefully. This does not mean accusation. It means reevaluation. Because in investigations like this, no one is assumed guilty, but no one is assumed irrelevant either. And that is a line that changes everything. Because once you cross into reevaluation, you don't go back. Now path 2 is just as powerful, because it does something that can be just as disruptive. It eliminates. It removes. It takes a theory that once held weight and collapses it. Because if what was found in that car does not connect to certain assumptions, then those assumptions fall apart. And when they fall apart, the case doesn't slow down. It redirects completely. And that redirection can be just as dangerous, because it means time was spent looking in the wrong direction. And now, everything has to catch up. So here we are. Two paths. One that tightens inward. One that forces the case outward. And investigators, right now, are standing in between them. Now let me ask you something again, because this is where your instincts matter. If evidence inside that car did connect to the scene, what would that mean to you? Drop it in the comments. Would that feel like confirmation or complication? Because for investigators, it's never just one. It's both. Now, this is where the case begins to expand again, but not in the way you think. Because expansion does not mean more chaos. It means more pattern. And patterns are what break cases open. Because while all of this is happening, while the car is being processed, while the lab is working in silence, something else has already been sitting in the background of this case. Something that didn't fully make sense at first, but now is starting to matter. A vehicle, seen, not at the house, not in the immediate area, but 2.5 miles away. Moving, vast, minutes after investigators believe Nancy was taken. Now stop right there, because this is not confirmation. It's possibility. But in cases like this, possibility is enough to change direction. Because once you introduce movement, You introduce intent. You introduce route. You introduce timing. And suddenly, the case is no longer confined to a single location. It stretches from the house to the road to wherever that movement leads. And here's the part that investigators cannot ignore, because they never do. That sighting, it was outside the original focus area, outside the initial timeline window, which means, at first, it wasn't the priority. But now, with the car under scrutiny, with evidence potentially connecting movement, that footage is no longer outside. It's inside. And when something moves from outside to inside an investigation, it becomes critical. Now think about what that does. Because now we're not just asking, what happened at the house? We're asking, what happened immediately after? Which road matters? Which direction matters? What speed matters? What behavior stands out? What was normal that night? And what was? And this is where cases become very dangerous for assumptions. Because a vehicle moving quickly at night could mean anything. Leaving, escaping, or simply existing at the wrong place, at the wrong time. But when that movement begins to align, even slightly, with other pieces of evidence, it stops being random and starts becoming relevant. And here where things begin to layer. Because investigators are no longer looking at one thing at a time. They are looking at everything. Together, doorbell footage, the masked figure, the blood on the porch, the DNA, the car, the sighting 2.5 miles away, the timing, the sequence, everything must now align. Because the truth in a case like this does not survive in isolation. It only survives where evidence agrees. And if one piece doesn't fit, it gets challenged, tested, re-examined, until it either holds or breaks. Now this is where the story takes a deeper turn. Because there is something about this case that doesn't sit where people expect it to. And it comes down to one idea, one that investigators quietly rely on, but rarely explain publicly. Sometimes, the most important clue is not what was found, it's how something moved. Movement, not just location, not just presence, but motion, speed, direction, timing, because motion tells you things objects cannot. It tells you urgency. Was there panic? Was there control? It tells you planning. Was the route direct or uncertain? It tells you escape. Was there hesitation or precision? And when you apply that idea to everything in this case, things start to shift again. Because now the question is no longer just, what was inside the car? It becomes, how did that car move that night? And whether that movement matches or contradicts everything else we think we know. Now let's slow this down again. Because this is where investigations begin to narrow. Quietly, subtly, but very deliberately. Authorities have said very little, but what they have said matters. They've indicated they are closer. They've confirmed they are reviewing multiple vehicles. And they've chosen, very intentionally, to withhold key details. And when investigators do that, it's not because they have nothing. It's because they have something they're not ready to lose control of. Because once information becomes public, it can no longer be contained. And in a case like this, control is everything. So what does that mean? It means the investigation is filtering. Weak theories fall away. Strong ones remain. And when that process begins, the case stops expanding. It starts tightening. Now we arrive at the most uncomfortable part of this story, because this is where pressure shifts away from evidence and onto people. Because at some point, every case reaches this moment where the question is no longer what happened, but who still fits? Who still fits inside the timeline? Who still fits inside the movement? Who still fits inside the evidence without contradiction? And just as important, who does? Because once someone no longer fits, they don't just fade out. They are removed, cleared, and every removal puts more weight on what remains. And that weight is what creates pressure, because gaps begin to matter. Small ones, minutes, movements, moments that cannot be fully explained. And those gaps, they don't stay small for long. Now, before this goes any further, we need to ground this again, because there is a line in every investigation, one that separates discipline from speculation. And investigators in this case have been very clear about that line. They are not nomming suspects. They are not confirming theories. They are not engaging with unsupported claims. And that matters because it protects the integrity of the case. It protects the evidence, and it ensures that when something is revealed, it holds, not just publicly, but legally. And that is a level of control that takes time, which is why 6 weeks can feel like both a long time and no time at all. Because while the public waits, the investigation moves in silence. Now we come back to where we started, that car, because everything we've walked through, every shift, every question, every possibility, leads back to it, not as a detail, but as a pivot, because whatever was found inside that vehicle has forced investigators to look at this case differently, to question movement, to rebuild time, to test assumptions, to narrow truth. And that is what makes this moment so critical, because this case is no longer drifting. It is tightening. And when a case begins to tighten like this, it means one thing. Somewhere inside all of this, there is a version of events that fits everything, every movement, every trace, every second. And when that version is found, it won't feel like a guess. It will feel like something that was always there, waiting to be seen. So now the question becomes, how close are they to seeing it? And more importantly, when they do, who does that version point to? Because here's the part of this case that investigators will never rush. The moment when everything finally aligns. Not almost, not partially, but completely. Because until every piece agrees, they don't move. And right now, all signs suggest they are getting closer to that point. But not there yet, which means something is still being tested, still being confirmed, still being challenged. And that brings us back one more time to the car, not just as an object, but as a timeline. Because when investigators say a case is tightening, what they really mean is this: there are fewer versions of the truth left, and every version that remains must pass through the same filter, Time. Now think about that. Because time is the one thing that cannot be negotiated. You can change a story. You can adjust a memory. You can even attempt to explain away evidence. But time either fits or it doesn't. And if what was found inside that car connects to a specific moment, then that moment becomes fixed, locked, unmovable. And once a moment becomes fixed, everyone connected to that moment has to fit inside it. Exactly. No gaps, no overlaps, no inconsistencies. And that is where pressure reaches its highest point. Because now, it's no longer about what could have happened. It's about what must have happened. Now let's walk into that pressure. Because this is where investigators begin doing something very specific. They start reconstructing movement, second by second, minute by minute. Where was the car before that night? Where was it during? Where was it after? What routes are possible? What routes are impossible? What distances make sense? What distances don't? Because remember that number from the beginning, 2.5 miles. It doesn't sound like much. But in a case like this, distance is everything. Because distance creates windows. Windows create timing. And timing creates truth. Now imagine this with me. A vehicle seen 2.5 miles away, moving quickly, minutes after Nancy is believed to have been taken. That's not just movement. That's a window, a narrow one. Because for that vehicle to be relevant, it has to fit inside a very specific sequence. Arrival, contact, departure, and that entire sequence must align with everything else. The footage, the blood, the timeline, and now, the car. So investigators begin asking the hardest question in cases like this. Is that movement possible? Not theoretically, but physically. Could a vehicle leave that location, reach that road, in that amount of time, at that speed, without being seen elsewhere, without contradiction? Because if the answer is yes, then that movement becomes viable. And if it's viable, it becomes dangerous. Because now, you have a path. Now let's go deeper. Because this is where motion becomes something more than just speed. It becomes behavior. Was the vehicle accelerating, decelerating, maintaining speed? Because each of those tells a different story. Acceleration suggests urgency, escape. Deceleration suggests awareness, caution, control, steady speed. That suggests something else entirely. Planning, confidence. And when investigators analyze motion, they're not just looking at how fast something moved. They're asking, why did it move that way? Because behavior reveals intent. Now hold that thought, because this is where the case begins to narrow again. Even further, because once movement is mapped, and timelines are tested, and evidence begins to agree, there is a moment, a very specific moment, where investigators stop looking at everything and start focusing on what remains. And when that happens, the case becomes very quiet, very controlled, very deliberate. And that's exactly where this investigation appears to be right now. Because authorities have not expanded outward. They've narrowed inward. They've confirmed they are reviewing multiple vehicles, not just one, which means they are comparing, filtering, testing which vehicle fits, Which one does? Which one aligns with the timeline? Which one breaks it? Because in the end, only one version survives. Now let me bring you into something investigators rarely say out loud, but always consider. When a case reaches this stage, someone already knows. Not necessarily everything, but enough. Enough to understand what happened. Enough to understand the movement. Enough to understand the timeline. And the question becomes, who is that person? Because information in cases like this does not disappear. It sits, it waits, and sometimes it's held out of fear, out of loyalty, out of uncertainty. And when that happens, the investigation has to do something very specific. It has to close the gap between what is known and what can be proven, because knowing something and proving it are not the same. And that gap is where cases either break open or stall. Now think about everything we've walked through. The house, the blood, the masked figure, the unanswered timeline, the car, the traces inside it, the movement 2.5 miles away, the reconstruction of time, all of it layered, connected, tested, and now filtered. So what remains? That is the question investigators are asking right now. Not publicly, but internally. What still holds? What still fits? What cannot be explained away? Because once you find that, you don't have a theory anymore. You have a direction. And direction leads to answers. Now, before we go further, I want you to think about this carefully. If everything in this case had to align around one single version of events, what would that version look like to you? Where does it start? Where does it end? And most importantly, what role does that car play in it? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the way people see a case from the outside can reveal patterns others miss. And right now, this case is all about patterns. Because here's the reality. The truth in this case is no longer hidden. It's just not fully assembled yet. Every piece is there, somewhere, in evidence, in movement, in time, in what was left behind. And when those pieces finally lock into place, the answer will not feel surprising. It will feel inevitable, like something that was always pointing in one direction. We just didn't see it clearly until now. So we come back to the quiet center of this entire story. Not the house, not the camera, not even the person behind the mask, but that vehicle, sitting still, saying nothing, but holding everything. Because in the end, this case may not be solved by what anyone says. It may be solved by what that car refuses to hide. And the closer investigators get to understanding that, the closer they get to understanding what really happened to Nancy Guthrie. And when that moment comes, it won't be a question anymore. It will be a conclusion, one built not on assumption, but on evidence that finally agrees. And when evidence finally agrees, something very specific happens. Silence breaks. Not all at once, not in a dramatic announcement, but in small, controlled steps. Because investigators don't reveal everything when they reach clarity. They reveal only what they can prove. And that difference is where cases like this are won or lost. Now let's step into that moment, the one just before everything becomes public. because this is where the investigation becomes most dangerous. Not for the public, but for whoever is still inside that narrowing circle. Because by now, the margin for error is gone. Every movement has been tested, every timeline challenged, every piece of evidence compared against everything else. And what remains is not possibility, it's consistency. And consistency is what exposes truth. Now imagine this from the investigator's perspective. You have a timeline, not a rough one, a precise one. You know when something likely happened. You know how long certain movements would take. You know what evidence connects to which moment. And then, you take a person, or a vehicle, or a version of events, and you place it inside that timeline. Does it fit? Or does it break something? Because if it breaks even one part of that timeline, it cannot be the truth. And that is how cases are solved. Not by what sounds convincing, but by what refuses to break under pressure. Now bring that back to the car, because this is where everything becomes very clear. If what was found inside that vehicle connects to a specific place, at a specific time, then that vehicle becomes fixed inside the timeline. And once it's fixed, it can't move freely anymore. It can't be explained in multiple ways. It can't belong to different versions of events. It belongs to one, only one, and anyone connected to that vehicle must now fit inside that same version. Exactly. Now here, where things become even more intense. Because investigators don't just look at what fits. They look at what almost fits. Because sometimes, the most revealing detail in a case is not the contradiction. It's the near match. The version that is close, but not exact. Because that's where adjustments happen. Stories shift. Details change. Explanations evolve. And when that happens, investigators notice. Because consistency does not evolve. It holds. So if something connected to that car has changed over time, even slightly, that becomes a signal. A quiet one, but a powerful one. Now let's go deeper into something that doesn't get talked about enough. Because this is where the psychological pressure of a case like this reaches its peak. When evidence begins to close in, people react. Not always outwardly, not always in ways that are obvious, but internally. Because when someone knows that a timeline is tightening, they begin to calculate. What do investigators know? What can they prove? What might they find next? And that calculation changes behavior. Sometimes it creates silence. Sometimes it creates over-explanation. Sometimes it creates mistakes. And in cases like this, mistakes are not small. They're defining. Because one inconsistency, one gap, one moment that doesn't align, can undo everything. Now think about how that connects to the car. Because if that vehicle has become central to the timeline, then anything connected to it, movements, statements, access, must now withstand that same level of scrutiny. And not just once, repeatedly, from different angles, at different times. Because the truth, when tested, does not change. Now this is where investigators begin doing something very strategic. They don't rush to conclusions. They apply pressure. Quietly, they revisit details. They re-ask questions. Not because they don't know the answers, but because they're watching for consistency. Because when someone is telling the truth, their answers stay the same. But when someone is adjusting to new information, their answers begin to shift. And those shifts, even the smallest ones, become evidence. Now let me ask you something again, because this is where your instincts come into play. If you knew that a single object, a car, held the key to an entire timeline, what would you focus on? The inside, the movement, the access, or the connection to people? Drop your answer, because in this case, it may not be just one of those things. It may be all of them, working together. Now we're approaching the final phase of what we can see from the outside. Because beyond this point, the investigation becomes even more controlled, more precise, more deliberate. Because once investigators believe they understand what happened, they don't announce it. They prepare it. They build it. They test it. Because in the end, it's not about what they believe. It's about what they can prove in a way that cannot be challenged. Now bring everything together. The house, the blood, the masked figure, the unanswered timeline, the car, the traces inside it, the movement 2.5 miles away, the reconstruction of time, the narrowing of possibilities, the pressure on consistency. All of it has led to this point where the case is no longer expanding. It is focusing. And when a case focuses like this, it means something very simple. The number of possible truths has dropped significantly. And when that number gets low enough, the real version of events begins to stand out. Not because it's obvious, but because it's the only one left that works. Now here's the part that should stay with you, because this is what makes this case so unsettling. The answer may not come from a confession. It may not come from a witness. It may not even come from something new being discovered. It may come from something that has been there the entire time, sitting, silent, unmoving, but holding everything. That car, because whatever was found inside it, has already begun reshaping this case. We just haven't seen how far that reshaping goes yet. And when we do, when that final alignment happens, when every piece locks into place, the story of what happened to Nancy Guthrie will not feel like a mystery anymore. It will feel like something that was always pointing in one direction. We just didn't follow it far enough. Until now. So the question is no longer, what was found? The question is, what does it prove? And how much closer are investigators to showing us the answer? Because right now, this case is sitting in the most dangerous place it can be. Not at the beginning, not in confusion, but right at the edge of clarity. And when an investigation reaches this point, everything slows down. On purpose, not because there is nothing left to do, but because what happens next has to be exact. Now imagine this. Investigators are no longer asking broad questions. They're not looking for new possibilities. They are testing one, over and over again, from every angle. Because when a case narrows this tightly, there is usually a version of events that keeps surviving. Every test, every comparison, every challenge, it holds. And when something holds like that, it becomes the focus. Not publicly, but internally, quietly, deliberately. Now this is where the shift happens. Because the investigation is no longer about discovery. It's about confirmation. And confirmation is what turns theory into action. But here's the part most people never see. Because before anything is announced, before any name is spoken, before any arrest is made, there is a phase, a silent phase, where everything must be built to withstand challenge. Because in the end, this case is not solved when investigators believe something. It is solved when they can prove it, without doubt, in a way that cannot be broken. So what does that look like? It looks like repetition, evidence reviewed again, then again, then again, timelines reconstructed, not once, but multiple times, from different starting points, different sequences. Because if the truth is real, it doesn't collapse when you approach it from another angle. It stays the same. Now bring that back to the car, because this is where its role becomes absolute. If that vehicle is now central to the timeline, then everything connected to it must be locked in. When it was used, how it was used, where it was, who had access, and whether every one of those answers matches the version of events investigators are testing. Exactly. Now think about what that means. Because if even one of those elements doesn't align, the entire structure weakens, and investigators won't move forward on something that weakens. They wait. They test again. They close every gap until nothing is left open. And that is where this case appears to be right now. In that final tightening, where loose ends are no longer tolerated, where uncertainty is being reduced to zero. Now here's something else that matters, because this is where the pressure becomes real. Not visible, but real. Because when investigators reach this stage, they don't just rely on evidence. They rely on consistency over time. They watch, they listen, they compare, not just what was said at the beginning, but what is said now. Because if the timeline is tightening and the evidence is aligning, then anything that doesn't match that alignment stands out immediately. And that is where cases break open, not always through discovery, but through contradiction. Now let me ask you something again, because this is the moment where your perspective matters most. If investigators are this close, what do you think they're waiting for? Is it one final piece of evidence? One final confirmation? Or is it something else? Something procedural? Something legal? That has to be in place before they move. Drop your thoughts, because the answer to that question is what separates suspicion from action. Now we move into the final layer of this case. Because once investigators believe they understand what happened, their focus shifts again, from building the case to protecting it. Because from this point forward, every step matters, every word matters, every move matters. Because one mistake, one premature reveal, one gap can compromise everything. And that is why silence becomes strategy, not absence. Strategy, because what is being built right now is not just an explanation. It is a case that must hold in the face of challenge. Think about everything this case has been from the beginning. A disappearance with no immediate explanation. A house that held signs of violence, but no clear sequence. A masked figure on camera, but no identity. A timeline that refused to settle. And for weeks, all of it existed in fragments, disconnected, unresolved. But now, those fragments are no longer floating. They are being pulled together by one central force. That car, because whatever was found inside it did not just add information. It created direction. It forced investigators to stop looking everywhere and start looking specifically at time, at movement, at connection. And once that happens, a case stops being a mystery and starts becoming a structure, one where every piece must support the other or be removed. Now here is the part that changes everything. Because when a structure like that is complete, it does something very simple. It leaves no space. No space for alternative explanations. No space for coincidence. No space for contradiction. Only one version of events remains. And that version is what investigators have been working toward. Quietly, relentlessly. Now let me bring you into the final question. The one that sits at the center of everything we've explored. Because at the beginning, we asked what was found inside the car. But now, that question has evolved. It's no longer just about the object. It's about the impact. What did that discovery change? What did it connect? What did it eliminate? What did it confirm? Because whatever it was, it forced a shift strong enough to tighten an entire investigation. And that does not happen without consequence. Now pause for a second, because this is where your perspective matters one last time. If a single object, a vehicle, can reshape a case this completely, what does that tell you about what may have been left inside it? Drop your final thoughts below. Because sometimes, the most important answers are not the ones investigators announce. They're the ones you can already begin to see when all the pieces are placed in front of you. Now we step back, not to conclude, but to understand where this leaves us. No suspect has been named. No final statement has been made. The investigation is still active. Evidence is still being tested. But something has changed. Fundamentally, this case is no longer open-ended. It is narrowing. And when a case narrows like this, it means the truth is no longer hidden. It is contained within a set of facts that are beginning to agree. And when facts agree, they become something stronger than theory. They become direction. Now remember this, because it may be the most important line in this entire story. The answer in this case may not come from what was said. It may not come from a witness. It may not even come from something new. It may come from something that has been there since the beginning. Something silent, something overlooked, something that did not need to speak, because it was already holding everything. That car, because in the end, it may not just be a piece of evidence. It may be the moment this entire case turned. And when that turn is finally revealed, when investigators show us what they've been building in silence, we won't just see what happened. We'll understand it clearly, completely, and without doubt. So now we wait, not for speculation, not for assumption, but for the moment when evidence speaks. And when it does, the story of Nancy Guthrie will no longer be a question. It will be an answer, one that was always there, hidden not in what was missing, but in what was left behind.